Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone's having a good day. Today, we're really excited to have Marina Kim with us. And she holds many hats, but the reason that you're probably here is that she's co-founded and leads Ashoka University and has been with kind of in the field of social innovation for about 15 years. So she's going to tell us a little bit more about her work with Ashoka University, which works with colleges and universities to embed social innovation as part of the focus of in education and so forth. So I know that you've worked with thousands of educators and hundreds of institutions, and represent many students globally. I think it's useful to note that you can not only learn from her today, but her writings have appeared in Forbes.com and SSIR and Diversity and Democracy Journal, et cetera, Chronicle of Philanthropy. So there's a lot of things that you can follow up with based on our conversation here today, and I'm sure you will want to after our conversation. It's always fun to be named in the Forbes 30 under 30 for social entrepreneurship. Some of us in the room, are past that. We can't possibly be named in the Forbes under 30, under 40, no, under 50. I got a couple months left. But in any event, we're excited to have you here today, and please join me in welcoming Marina.
Awesome, thank you. And actually, if I could just do a quick poll of who's in the room. And so if you're a student, whether it's grad or undergrad or postdoc, if you could raise your hand. Okay, yeah. Faculty, staff, awesome. Community members. Awesome, great, okay. It's a really great mix.
It's a nice mix.
Awesome.
So this year she's also in the Brittingham Lab. She's in the Social Entrepreneur in residence. So she's actually available to meet with, sort of on the once a week kind of basis. So you can follow up with her later as well.
Okay. Or I'll leave the link.
We'll definitely put your information up.
Perfect.
So I just thought I would start by asking Marina to tell us a little bit about her journey in the field of social entrepreneurship, and then to Ashoka, and then kind of what you're trying to accomplish in your work right now.
Okay, so I wear many hats, and it's also interesting, given who's in the room, that I'll actually try throughout the conversation to represent my own personal hat, because I represent the forward-looking journey of someone who's been trying to figure out how to make a difference, how to figure out the most strategic place to make a difference, and how I can leverage my unique strengths. And I'm also able to wear the hat of being a member of one of the longest running organizations dedicated to advancing social innovation and having the largest global network of social entrepreneurs in the world, which basically, as a lifelong student, I basically get to learn from the best practitioners of social impact who are working, around us, and we're hearing about them every single day. So I get to be in the trenches doing the work as a social entrepreneur, intrapreneur myself, and also get to learn alongside a lot of people doing it in every single different field. So just to start with my own personal story, and can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. Half Korean, half American. I grew up half my life in the US, and then my mom married a British guy, so I grew up from age 10 to 18 in northern England. All of this is somewhat relevant in that the contrast from living in a small village in a rural area in northern England, which has a very strong sense of identity and historical pride from being the seat of the Industrial Revolution and having, my neighbor was like a wire factory. So like steel factories, wire factories, coal mines, like that was like our day-to-day life, and the parents and grandparents, and that was like the story. To go from that to college, which happened to be right in Silicon Valley, which had more of a narrative of building the future, you are the future, let's create the future will be better than the past. Like, what is the past? That was like 10, 20 years ago, whereas in England, it was like centuries. Every building, the house I lived in was 250 years old, and it's hard to find anywhere in the US that's 250 years old. So again, just a sense of like history and future was a pretty strong juxtaposition. And I have to say, going from a past narrative of like the past was great, not sure about the future, to then being like, the future is great, what are you gonna do about it, was pretty inspiring as a young person who is very eager to get inspired. And so pretty quickly I learned about social innovation and saw a social entrepreneur speak, joined every single club, ended up leading the clubs, quickly overcommitted myself, got very burnt out, but that was a learning process. And learned how to work with and through networks of students, learned how to work with and through networks of faculty, tried to figure out how to have student voice to change the curriculum. And that became for me the training ground of leadership, where it was learning that actually a university is a system. And that if you can maneuver how to play the game of being a student, while also realizing that students have a lot of power in terms of being a consumer of the system and can build relationships with other students to make it even collective power and know how to navigate who has pockets of resources in the institution, whether it's centers or department chairs or deans or VPs, like how do you influence those resources and leverage partnerships so that groups of students and networks of faculty and students can actually be much more powerful than any single student could be. So it was, for me, training ground for what I continue to now do 15 plus years later. But for me, it was very much like learning a system was as much about learning the relationships that make up the system and learning how power and resources in that system work. So for me, that was really helpful. And so I ended up graduating, ending up at Ashoka. And for me, the questions were all around, as a student, how could I learn how to make a social impact in my studies and post-graduation? And then as a student leader, how can I be supportive of getting as many other students to learn how to make a social impact through their studies and after graduation? And that then became actually my job. So I continue to have the role that I have been at Ashoka for 12 plus years at, working on how can we support universities and colleges to equip students to have the mindset and the skill set through their curriculum and the co-curriculum and the culture to learn how they can have a social impact and then graduate to do so. So
do you have a favorite story about how Ashoka's been able to create that ecosystem for students? You can either name the university or keep them nameless, but just something that's emerged where you were kind of excited about.
I mean, there's so many examples. So it's as much about, and it depends on the institution. Half the problem is there are so many universities that have too many resources, but they're not clear for students to figure out. So it's as much about making them connected so that students also are aware of them and it's easy to take advantage of all their learning and resources. So that's kind of one set of challenges. And so a lot of it ends up becoming, if you can bake it into the student recruiting and into the student onboarding, so student orientations, a lot of our most comprehensive institutions that are really taking this seriously have their president or their provost talk about, if you want to make a difference, you should come to our institution. And that's actually how they're talking to students. And then when students come in their first week of orientation, they actually get exposed to, yes, you're going to learn your discipline or your major, but you're also hopefully going to take away skills that you'll apply to your whole life about how to make a difference. And so it's as much about, yes, you need to have the substance, but I think if you don't signal the substance, it won't get taken advantage of. And actually, if you signal your values externally, it can even actually create a demand cycle. So we've heard anecdotally a lot of the campuses that we work with that have worked really hard to bake in courses, programs, and make it pretty comprehensive and easy to access. That helps them with their faculty, staff, and student recruiting. And I think what's exciting is, as we see, I'm just a millennial, but as we also see Gen Z, students really want to have opportunities where they're learning something that gets a credential, because that's important and you can put it on a resume, but you actually want experience, you want skills, you want to be able to translate it into something where you can make a difference, whether it's inside an organization or outside.
That's cool.
So,
Thank you. So last year's Social Entrepreneur in Residence at the Brittingham Lamb, Saul Garlick, spoke to our community, and he noted that, and this is probably a little bit of a straw man or kind of a thin characterization, but if you rolled back kind of the field of social entrepreneurship and those people who wanted to be social entrepreneurs either in a nonprofit setting or a for-profit setting, there was a lot of enthusiasm. There was a lot of things where people saw a specific problem, and so they knew that they wanted to create an enterprise as part of a solution to that specific problem. But he noted that there's now kind of this gap, and there's a lot of conversation around scale and systems change and so forth, but he felt like that some of the problem solving that was happening, especially in his work, which was in, I think, Liberia and other parts of the developing world, were hitting this barrier because it wasn't linked to systems change. How have you seen kind of that orientation shift, and what are some of the big challenges there, trying to orient oneself towards systems change and in the field of social innovation?
So just from my own experience, I think I a little bit reject the heroic entrepreneur narrative, and that's increasingly being questioned. It's not physically human, and that's why there's such a high rate of stress and burnout when people are trying to expect that from people who are not superhuman. But B, I don't think it's inclusive and welcoming for people who wanna live a great life and not kill themselves for a cause. So I am actually a huge fan, and I have personal experience in this with the concept of being an intrapreneur. And that is that if you can innovate within existing systems, you've actually baked in the potential for scale from where you sit. And so most entrepreneurs have to create their own organization from scratch. It takes a huge amount of effort to create an organization from scratch. It takes a huge amount of effort to build a team from scratch. It takes a huge amount of effort to scale and create a brand for yourself from scratch. Like, it's really hard. And you're lucky to keep going, let alone have like this massive scale. Versus it's harder in the front side to know how to maneuver a system and to get resources and to get power and influence. However, if you can find a foothold, you can find a system, and if you can, and if you're, there is a slightly different wiring of people who want to do everything their own way and don't want to be constrained by a system. So again, there's still a personality type difference between entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs, but there's a lot more similarities than differences, because it is about seeing opportunity, seeing resources, seeing people, and building partnerships. It just happens to be that the system you're working with is a bit more of a contained system, rather than one that you're from the outside trying to influence. So that's one piece. So I personally think that you can bake in, and I think universities are a great place to do this, the brand power you have if you can influence a university, or let alone a university system, the resources you can influence, the human capital you can influence. I mean, it's amazing. And then think about it if you're a corporation or government. Like, you need entrepreneurs and innovation talent from inside every single kind of organization. And often you just need to learn how to maneuver and position yourself as having the next idea that can help the organization fulfill its mission.
How many people here, if you don't mind me interrupting for a second, have heard the term intrapreneur before today? So just a few. So this is a new term for people, and I think you defined it, kind of in that way. Is there any other parts of the definition that you want to highlight so that people can get a sense for what does it mean to innovate as an intrapreneur versus as an entrepreneur?
I actually think it's a similar mindset, but a different skill set. Mm-hmm. So I would say an intrapreneur needs to work through influence, through people, and through networks, and an entrepreneur needs to build influence and build organizations that work with people and build networks. So it's slightly different, and there's a lot more diplomacy involved in being an intrapreneur, because you're basically working within the status quo, trying to change the status quo, and you have more resistance. And so the more you can speak the language of the people and the organizations you're trying to influence and activate, the more you can be seen as a trusted friend helping the organization evolve versus an enemy from within that will get very quickly rejected if you push too hard, too fast, too aggressively, and not diplomatically. So I'm sure some people have a sense of what I'm talking about. So I really think of an intrapreneur as a little bit like a kidney donation that can be rejected very easily, but if you can accept yourself into the system, you basically can power a system if you know how to maneuver that and leverage your role and be of value to the system while also making the system be of value to the mission you're trying to serve. And just the one other framework I wanted to offer, because systems change. I know we have a bunch of students and a bunch of folks. I don't know if all the staff and the students are tied to the price, basically the public policy school or a different school, but my sense is that social innovation and systems change are very strongly embedded into how learning happens here. But what's interesting is Ashoka has a framework, and it's not meant to be a value judgment, but it talks about 4 different levels of impact. I think it's really helpful because it's a bit of a self-diagnosis tool that some people are wired to really like to operate at a certain level of impact. So the first level is direct service, and that might be a soup kitchen, a homeless shelter. You basically get to feel and see the impact, and you get to directly serve people who are being affected in whatever way, shape, or form. And honestly, I think it's an emotional benefit, but it also takes an emotional toll, like people working with refugees or immigrants. Like really, I think some people are wired to be very effective in this work. Then there's scale direct service, and this tends to be larger professionalized organizations. Like almost imagine if an MBA took on like a soup kitchen and decided it would be the biggest and most scaled soup kitchen in the world, and it would serve like all of greater Los Angeles, and it had efficiency and operations and scale and a budget and fundraising, and it was really impressive in terms of how efficient and scaled. And so the Red Cross is one of the largest nonprofits in the world. I mean, the CEO is paid millions of dollars because it's basically like running a multi-million/billion-dollar corporation. It's a monolith. And so like the level of leadership complexity and sophistication you need to lead or run a program of the Red Cross is pretty mind-blowing. And there's many other organizations like that too that operate at scale. And so the focus here is scale, but it's still scale and really direct impact. The next level is systems change, and this is where Ashoka tends to operate. And often it's started by people who've had direct experience of some kind, but see that there's still structural barriers where you can keep literally, feeding someone and feeding someone and feeding someone, but there's still like, what if we go upstream and actually address why this is happening in the first place and take a much more systemic approach rather than really effectively addressing where the wound is bleeding. And so this is where a lot of social entrepreneurs and Ashoka Fellows operate. So what are the policy changes that you need to prevent the issue from becoming there in the first place? Or what are the networks of people who could actually prevent holistic care, because every issue is actually interconnected with a lot of other issues, and maybe there's a community level intervention that could actually address the issue that's triggering all these other issues. And then the final layer that Ashoka is trying to figure out how to do as well is, beyond changing specific systems, there's it's called framework change, and that's actually just values in society. So think about democracy. That's something that you have to actually do work to make a value and to make real. And some countries have it, some people don't, but it's something you actually need to constantly work towards as both a narrative and as an actuality. So I use this framework as something to help people understand. So starting from this it starts getting more scaled as you go further up the chain, but it also becomes more removed from heart and emotion. And so one of the things that I find interesting and important about systems change is that I actually think everyone should learn how to think in systems, but then secondarily, some people, you should find where you should fit in the system. We need people at all levels. And so I want to say everyone is important at all levels. And, God bless the MBAs for making sure that they can scale a lot of these things, but that's still a different way of thinking about scale than systems change, which doesn't always involve scaling an organization. And one of Ashoka's key insights is that actually spreading the idea, which might be a policy change lever to make an incentive for everyone to adopt a certain way of operating, or it might be like microcredit, like making it so well known as a model that, that has certain proof points that the model gets adopted and scaled. But you as a single organization don't have to scale it. It just becomes a global phenomenon.
That's a wonderful framework, and I'm sure the students in the room hope that there's some sort of social media quiz that they could take to know.
Yeah, what are you?
Am I going to be the level 1, level 2, level 3? Where am I suited? It's like the next personality test, if you will, for social change.
Yes.
It's not there yet, I'm assuming, or maybe Ashoka is about to develop it.
I think that's a great idea. We have an article on the framework, but not yet a self-diagnostic. But actually, so I was actually going to encourage people to get out there and date around at all levels, because a big part of it is to try it before you commit. In that, I think some people might think they're more of a head person, and then you do the, work in a think tank, and you're like, oh my God, what is this connected to? Like, where are the people? Like, where's the impact? And other people, and I speak to people like this a lot, are like, I really want to feel the impact. I've been in a corporate job. I'm so disconnected. And then they go, and then they're like, wait a minute. It's so scrappy. There's no resources. It's not going to scale. I can't really, I don't know, like it's not going to work for me. And so I think what people think they want is not always what they actually want.
That's great. So I have a couple other questions, and I want to turn it over to the audience to ask their questions as well. So one of the things that you and I had talked a little bit about in some of our initial conversations is that a lot of funders talk about wanting to fund systems change, but in reality, I've experienced this in the Center for Social Innovation, funded even our work, where we've actually seen, for instance, there was a funder who wanted to stop feeding the hungry, but change the system so we didn't have to feed the hungry, right? To your exact point. But then when it came down to it, they kind of just exited that work because they didn't feel like that they were best suited for that anymore. So where have you seen this mismatch sometimes between what funders say they want to do and then kind of actually how they provide funding for that kind of work?
So just as I said, what you think you might want in terms of the type of work you want to do and then how it feels when you're there, I think is exactly what happens a lot with funders. They think they want to be all strategic and whatever they define as that. For some people it's scale, and for some people it's the systemic change. And then the reality is, if they don't feel the impact of their work, which might be more clear in a much smaller scale direct service engagement, which may or may not be as like scaled or strategic or systemic, it doesn't feel good to them. And unfortunately or fortunately, philanthropy is completely at the discretion. It's particularly with high net worth individuals and family foundations. It's basically whatever feels good to them. And so I think that's where I am a huge advocate of more donor education. But also I think more donors should go through this process of where do you fit on the impact, on the scale spectrum? Where do you fit, and how can you value something but yet make sure that your needs, whether it's more emotional or how you feel connected to impact, is also met, but maybe you can still fund both or engage in both. So all this to say, what I find is that I think scale tends to be the sexiest thing that people actually want, but what's interesting is that tends to be biased towards the scale direct service definition of scale, which is usually more quantifiable and centralized. Again, it's more of like what an MBA definition of what a scaled organization can prove that they directly impacted, rather than a more systems change approach, which might actually say we've activated 10 partners to take on the work, but we're an enabler of these organizations, and then they do the work, but then you can't necessarily directly take credit that you did that. And so it actually, often scale is more incentivized towards proving you had the direct impact at scale, rather than you had scaled impact but may have enabled others to do the work, because it doesn't feel like you've had as much impact. So I think there's this question about impact and scale, and more centralized, more decentralized, or more scale direct service, which is linear and easy to see and count, versus arguably, I think the more you can enable others to have pretty much if 50 organizations rather than just one organization decided to take on an approach, you could have millions of people impacted, not just hundreds of thousands, but you can't prove it was directly because of you. So I think measurement and metrics and what they call attribution versus contribution, and how you take credit for the work that usually need to get funded, that's where I think the devil's in the details. And unfortunately, the metrics also unfortunately tend to back up a better argument for people who do more scale direct service.
Marina, for our community, I meant to ask you, before I asked that question, that framework that you laid out is published somewhere. Can you let our audience know where that's you wrote about
it's
that?
called Rethinking the Impact Spectrum. It's on the Ashoka U blog, so if you just write my name and then Rethinking the Impact Spectrum. It's not my idea, it's Ashoka's, but I like to be a translator of Ashoka frameworks in a way that can be relevant for educators and students.
Thanks, Marina. The last question I was going to ask was just about, you had mentioned kind of emotional labor as part of this kind of work, and just from thinking about it from a broad wellness perspective, if you're really trying to address social problems over the long term, that's a real element of it that people have to look in the mirror and realize that's going to be part of their work. Have you found anything in your own career journey that has helped you kind of navigate the balance between diving into that kind of emotional labor and kind of understanding the long-term perspective for seeing the kind of impact that you want in your own personal career?
And I think the long-term perspective is so one other thing I was going to say is that as I reflect on what's different from when I first got involved as a student, and I was like, oh my gosh, social innovation, this is exactly what I want to do with my life. It is so exciting. I get to have social impact and I get to be visionary and entrepreneurial and businessy, put it all together and that'll be my career path. It all sounds good, and then you start doing it, and it's 50,000 times harder because systems are complicated, people are complicated, the status quo likes to stick, and the more you really try to make change, the more the status quo will push back at you, and so it's this really the kidney donation thing. It's like you're constantly figuring out the balance of how much can you push without getting rejected from the whole system. And so I think part of the challenge is to actually make an impact takes a long time. And honestly, I was not mentally prepared for that. When you're a student, your sense of time is in semesters, maybe summers, maybe a year. And so my whole plan when I left college was like, I'll do 2 years, we'll work on higher ed, change that system, then I'll go to get business school. And that was like, okay, 2 years, we'll get some pilots going. The sense of time is completely skewed from any sense of reality because you were, you didn't necessarily practice with those systems. It was all more academic and theoretical. So I actually think two of the biggest, hardest things in terms of the emotional toll is how do you sustain commitment and passion, not just for a semester, not just for a year, not just for 2 years, and then you already have your next step, but honestly, it's been nearly 12 years I've been doing Ashoka U and pushing not just one educational system, but we work very closely with nearly 50, very closely doing campus-wide change with dozens of people per campus and hundreds of institutions and thousands of educators, and each one of them represents a lot of work and a lot of challenge and a lot of insights, and trying to also emotionally support all of those people. Basically, a lot of us talk about it's basically pushing a boulder uphill, and how long can you push a boulder uphill? Are there ways to rest while pulling a boulder uphill, or will the whole boulder push you down the hill? And how do you support each other in the process? Because just as you just get older. I'm just tireder. My ability to lift a boulder is I don't know. I try to work out, but it's harder over time. So it's kind of just the cumulative toll. I think takes when you actually get more experience, you actually get more tired. It's actually that's a conundrum. So the honest truth is, I just think it's the challenge and the reality, and I think we need to get smarter on managing a long-term change process and not. So I like to talk about sprinting versus a marathon. You basically cannot sprint a marathon. You will die. Basically, the person who had to sprint the first marathon, he died. And so how do you pace yourself? How do you take breaks? And so a lot of what we've had to do as I've gone through various burnout cycles is we've put in a sabbatical policy. So every 4 years, we get paid leave for a month to recharge. We have a pretty generous vacation policy because we work so much. Basically, 2 weeks vacation is not enough. After every major annual event, we all get just a week off because the work to plan this event where it takes a whole year to push towards it, and then in the several months towards it, it's basically like planning a wedding every year. It's like the most stressful thing you ever do, and then you die, and then you need a week to like come back to life. And we built that into our cycles, and we got smarter because the first few years we were like, and come back to work on Monday. And we're like, we were dead for that week. So we were just like, let's just all take the week off, just you have to. And so figuring out like how to treat humans. We're not machines. We literally cannot be processing at 1,000, I don't know, RAM, whatever the computer terms are. I'm not a computer person. But like you cannot push, like robots can be pushed until they frazzle, but humans will burn out. And so actually I think what's beautiful is your body will actually give out before you kill yourself. So you can't overdo it. Like you'll actually mentally and physically fatigue and you'll get sick is usually what happens. And that's the sign that you're overdoing it. And then you have to listen. So I think it's just help your organization get smarter about the cycles of how humans actually work and how to sustain yourself with rest and breaks and energy over time, because it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And you need the emotional sustenance to keep going because there's so much fear, scarcity mindset when you're in trying to launch or fundraise or start anything up. You're basically being rejected 99% of the time because, again, the more you push the status quo, the more it pushes back and the more it will fight you. And so if you're doing anything truly innovative, you will be challenged. If you're doing anything truly radical, you will be, fought. And so that's where I think you almost need like a team of cheerleaders, advisors, mentors, and people who can provide practical skill sets and experience and networks. So the other thing is networks are key to give you access to both the expertise and the links to potential funders that, as a young person or as someone who is just starting something and maybe maybe you don't have all the funders on speed dial yet because, that's something you get through time and experience and through networks. So those are the things of how can you create roles for as many people as possible who have networks, who have experience, and who want you to succeed, because that's almost the buffer you need of emotional support and practical support to get you through the really hard times. Like the startup phase is truly challenging. It's challenging in other ways in terms of sustaining energy and momentum. And, there's different checkpoints at which funders decide they only fund startups. And then once you're not a startup, then you need to find growth funders. And then it's another really hard phase. So there's like other hard phases. But the startup phase is the most, I think, psychological uncertainty and the most where you're figuring things out and where more people who believe in you is honestly what will keep you going. So it sounds all touchy-feely, but honestly, the touchy-feely will translate into like hard, real impact. A community is basically a sum of what beliefs and values they have. And so I almost see it as either a foundation or an overarching environment in which a system operates. But a system can still have a lot of structure to it, and you can I want to tackle this part of the system and influence them to make this decision. It's a bit more like, not mechanical, it's still strategic, but you can target concrete things and this will affect this, which will affect this. You can be pretty logical about it and analytical, whereas framework change is inspiring millions and billions of people to believe stuff that will change how they behave. So it's much more, it's really important, really hard to do. It's a very specific way of operating. For a lot of people who need concrete something, it's pretty frustrating.
Yeah, the example that I often use when I teach social innovation, just even though any example is not perfect, right, is that alcoholism was horrific. People said we have to have systems change. Prohibition was that systems change, but it didn't come with hearts changing, right? And if anyone just a lot of times we look back on the way prohibition emerged and saying, well, that was silly. Who would ever thought of that craziness? Look at how bad the problem was and you'll see why it happened. But then if you look at what emerged, around the movement around Mothers Against Drunk Driving and that whole process that led to really a heart change, which says, it's wrong for me to drink and drive. Right, and actually people believe it now, but it was this interaction between legal system change and also people's values that, again, it was not just one led to the other or the other led to the other, but it was fully integrated in this dynamic, iterative sort of approach. And I think we're seeing some of that as it relates to the housing system now, and homelessness being this illness that we're seeing as in part a byproduct of what system we created. And so the status quo, finally, the people realize at some point inside it's not tenable anymore. And so then that opens up ways for hearts and minds and systems to move toward that new outcome and so forth. Yeah.
High net worth individuals and family foundations are harder to access, though therefore it biases towards people who already have great networks, which is not fair. But they're often more compelled by a great vision and not as demanding of metrics. And so if you can communicate through a storytelling approach the importance of a vision and the impact in a more narrative way rather than a data-driven way, that's where the funding will come from. Foundations are more accessible, more transparent, more accountable. They have processes, they have open application systems, so it's like anyone can access them. However, they tend to be so rigorous about how they measure, how, what they count, and proof. So it's, it's challenge. Yeah.
I always think that the word hard numbers or hard data sometimes is used as a weapon and also is quite misunderstood. The reality is, in my view, is that a lot of times what people are asking you for is data that's easy because it's there.
So
but it
easy
might
to
be
access or easy to understand?
Easy to access.
Okay.
But it's not necessarily the right data. It's not the evidence of impact. It's not the outcome you're trying to achieve and those kinds of things. And so what we end up having is this kind of misalignment between easier to access metrics, which then end up being the things that people are asking you to check boxes on and those kinds of things. And then people even call that hard data because it's data as opposed to story data, which again creates this false dichotomy of that rather than kind of moving toward more evidence frameworks where evidence, to get the right evidence for the outcome, you're going to need a variety of different tools to bring to bear to that and then really come in and not relying on the easiest to access metrics, right? So that's a lot of the tension. So part of the case that you're talking about that we've certainly seen and even operated with even our neighborhood data for social change platform, which is using easier to access data, but then merging it with kind of the stories and communities to actually provide the evidence framework, I think is really important. So you sometimes have to make the case, this is the outcome we're trying to achieve, this is the evidence that we're going to use to get there. And then, it can be certainly part of that evidence is the easier data to access, but it's rarely going to be the evidence that's really needed to show those kinds of outcomes. So I think that's something that you're hearing we wrestle with on our research work or in your practice work, and I think the field wrestles with as well.
Ashoka just came out with a report in collaboration with several other major social innovation organizations, and it's called Embracing the Complexity of Systems Change. And it's actually a report written for funders and about the funding challenges of getting funding for systems change work. And so there's an executive summary and then a 60+ page report. It was done in partnership with McKinsey, Echoing Green, Schwab Foundation, Skoll Foundation, like you name it, every major player in social innovation. And it was actually just launched at Davos, at the Skoll World, in Davos. And so it's Ashoka's attempt to try to articulate that there's this important need for funding for this high impact work. And here's examples of the impact. Why is it so hard to fund? And they're trying to circulate it to all the funders. So it's back to the donor education piece that you have to make a good, strong case. And again, by partnering with McKinsey, you got the MBAs in the room to make the case to the people who think that way, but for something that we think is valuable and important that may or may not fit all those boxes. Yeah. I personally think the biggest way to get at people who have the potential to give is figure out, can you find someone who speaks their language that they trust and have them become part of your fundraising process? And so really understanding the psychology of who they trust, and basically funders often fund people they trust and they fund people who are funded by people they trust. So I actually think leveraging your existing donors to find one degree of separation to it's basically using trust networks. People are very risk averse. And so one way to it's basically not educating them. It's actually just working within how they work, which is trust circles. But then if you did want to educate them and they were willing to be engaged, there's those that are educated through head. And then there could be really interesting things of how do you get articles. There's tons of articles, and maybe even the article by Ashoka about systems change funders. How can you get influential theory and articles written by influential organizations, whether it's the McKinsey's or USC, so it's like figuring out how to theoretically get through to people and use argument and evidence. So that would be one. And I know even from our university network, people who invite people to be part of a donor funder collective and you call it something, you brand it something, and then you educate them. You actually have them come to courses and workshops where you can educate them to fund things that you do really well and why it's strategic. But that's a more academic approach. Then there's the more experiential, and people who are more, they fund because of their heart and not necessarily their head. Often it's a hybrid, and then it's how do you get them as engaged in as much direct impact and as much direct exposure to the work that you are able to do and the people you most directly serve, because there's a bunch of people who are not influenced by the head argument. So
great. Well, please join me in thanking Marina Kim for